Yo, what up, guys? Coach Tim here, and with the preseason changes, there's also some meta changes that I would like to talk about. Corki is one of these champions that has been affected by the meta changes, and before we jump into what's exactly going on, I would like to show you a play of what's going on. So, in this play, let's analyze it real quick. I'm 002, I'm decently farmed, I just reached my 2 power spikes, being Mura Mana and Ravenous Hydra, but I don't have any stacks on the Ravenous Hydra yet. So let's see what happens. I come from base, and I instantly one-shot enemy Wukong and Akali at the same time without them understanding what's going on and basically getting a free Baron from this. So I believe Corki is extremely strong in the right scenarios, and I'll explain why when we jump into the video. Let's go. So to understand why Corki is much stronger than before, we have to understand what has changed. First of all, one of his core items, especially on his poke build, is Ravenous Hydra. So what has changed with Ravenous Hydra? Well, of course, it got the mini rework. It now stacks. It's like the AD Magi's, and it's a bit more expensive, but it also gives way more AD. And especially that AD is extremely important for Corki because Corki scales extremely hard on AD. We do know that Ravenous Hydra will get nerfed the next patch. What will exactly get nerfed? That's the splash damage that becomes 60 to 50% and 30 to 25 at max range. And it gets the Omni Vamp at full stacks gets removed. But that's completely fine for Corki because the splash damage is already quite interesting because the R has a short range, and that's exactly what we want to combine the splash damage with. And the Omni Vamp he doesn't really care about. So the Ravenous Hydra changes won't really affect him, and I think it will still save the same purpose on Corki in the next patch. So one more thing that's changed is the meta, and especially the jungle meta and how mid lane resides with that. So most of the games are going to be played around dragon stacking right now because of the meta changes. A lot of early dragons are going to be taken, and Corki really likes when the meta is played around dragons because of his package, of course. Being a very good tool, zoning around the dragon, engaging around dragon is just extremely good around objectives. Also that, but also the jungle changes have been massive. The champions that reside in jungle right now are designed in that way that Corki is very good against them because there's a lot more ganking because of the jungle clear speed and the later scuttle. And Corki is actually quite good when there's a lot of ganking because of his W. His W is extremely good for self-beating. So he has a lot of safety against these current junglers. So what makes Corki actually good? I think one of these things is his rune page and his summoner spells. So Corki runs, in my opinion, the two strongest rune trees in the game. One of them is Inspiration, and the second one is Resolve. Inspiration, he gets a lot of gold and a lot of value from First Strike. Corki likes to burst people, he likes to scale. First Strike is exactly what that does. It helps him reach his power spike sooner, and once he is strong, he will deal massively more damage with the First Strike. Also, the boots rune, he really likes to skill. He doesn't need the early boots, he's not looking for early skirmishes, so he can basically skill up and get free gold. Cookies strengthens his early lane, which is slightly weak, and also gives him more damage because Corki skills on mana due to his Mura mana. Then lastly, Cosmic Insight. Well, Cosmic Insight is just OP. Who doesn't like shorter flash cooldown and TP cooldowns? Especially the TP cooldown, which really scales well with his package later into the game. And now we're going to talk about Resolve. Why is Resolve so damn good on Corki? Well, first of all, he has a lot of options in Resolve. Let's start with the Overgrowth. Corki really likes to skill, value his farm, and Overgrowth really works with that. The more HP he has, the harder he is to kill and assassinate later into the game. Then the second line from the Resolve tree is it's very flexible and it depends game on game what he needs. If he's playing against control mages, he really likes to go for Second Wind. If he's playing against assassins, he will go for Bone Plating, and this will really strengthen his early lane, which is quite weak usually. And if we can get through that early lane, I'm pretty confident we can carry in the mid to late game once we reach our power spikes and can play with our packages. Into certain lanes, which he doesn't get challenged in lane, or that are also scaling lanes, you can also opt in for conditioning and be extremely strong late game. Moving on, what else makes Corki so good at the moment? Well, we already talked about the meta and how that interacts with what Corki wants to do as a champion, but also his build and starting items make him very good. Corki is very flexible with his starting items. He can start Curl against scaling matchups. He can start as Longsword with Refillable Potion, which is my favorite start, and get a lot of free gold by not having to buy Refillable Potion after your first base. His build pad is very easy with long swords, very cheap. Moreover, he's got insane range, and when he has 2 items or more, he deals a lot of damage. He's also very flexible because with his range and with him being a scaling mage, he also has his mobility with his W, and his scaling is of course almost a match with what package allows him to do. The next thing is his package plus teleport. Package can be combined with teleport for a surprise attack onto the enemies. We can flank with our package. We can engage with our package, zone people with our package. And once we pick a package and TP, people fail to realize that we're on our package and then can get surprised when we're already next to them because we teleported in after taking package. So with our rune setup and with our build and with our W, we are able to minimize lane very well. So our weakness is something that we can minimize and then play towards our strength later. This is especially good in competitive, but in solo queue, we can also make it work. So what are Corki's weaknesses? Corki's early game is very, very weak, especially our early skirmishes. Before we get our first item Muramana, I don't recommend skirmishing, and we should be very careful in our lane. There's a lot of lanes where we actually are quite strong because we can start a long sword, and with our TP, we can get a lot of tempo resets. So our early game is definitely not the worst in the 1v1, but when it comes to having more champions involved, that's when we gotta be very, very careful. We're also very reliant on item spikes. If we don't hit our item spikes, we're gonna do very little damage. So once we're behind, it can sometimes be hard to come back. And lastly, but definitely not least, some matchups are just extremely hard for Corki. Hence is why I think it's important to also look at draft, and that's something that we're going to look on right now. Because our early game is so weak and because our late game is so strong, I think it's very important that we dive deep into the draft and why certain champions are good for him to be picked in and why some champions you really want to avoid. So as we can see instantly, there's a lot of very good matchups for Corki, and there's quite little bad matchups. But the bad matchups are the matchups that we really want to avoid. So let's jump into the bad matchups first. Why do we want to avoid these matchups? AD matchups. Corki really struggles into AD matchups with dashes and assassins. That's all what these champions do. We're just not going to win it. We're going to have to give too much CS, and we're probably not going to be able to skill. Hence is why picking Corki blind and getting counterpicked by one of these champions is not good. Then there's also champions in the mediocre category that basically fall into the same categories as the avoid champions, but we have some counterplay to these champions. And counterplay to these champions are usually in the runes. For example, Victor is a champion that can really mess Corki up, but because we can minimize so well with our range and with the fact that we can take second wind, we can actually survive the matchup pretty well. Same as Silas. It's a very hard matchup to beat, and Silas will want to go in on you all the time, but bone plating makes sure that he cannot one-shot us, and that means that we can actually get a bit more CS than that we're used to in these kind of matchups. So the runes really allow us to drag us through these kind of mediocre matchups. And one more thing that I think is very, very good to emphasize here is against these AP assassins, there's one key item that we built, and that's Hex Drinker. Early Hex Drinker on Corki is OP, especially against these bursty AP champs. And that's exactly why there's so many AP champions in the very good category. Because if there's a champion like LeBlanc being picked into us or Vex being picked into us, what we can do is we can buy an early Hex Drinker. We're never under threat of being solo killed by them, and we can basically minimize very effectively. Also, if we have if the enemy has 2 AP damage threats into the team, we can easily build this to Maw of Marmortius. Well, I cannot speak, but that means we also have a very strong 2 item spike together with Muramana, and they're all very cheap items. We're getting a lot of gold on Corki with our runes. So it just combines very, very nicely. But most of these champions, why are they so good for us in draft? They're not able to punish our early game. We're able to skill better than them. We outrange them. Or, for example, bone plating absolutely cooks them. High Talon. Um, so that's basically it. And because there's so many good matchups and a few bad matchups, what I recommend doing when you want to play Corki is really scout for a good draft and ensure that we can get ourselves a good matchup. Because if we can get ourselves a good matchup, it's going to be a very easy game to play. It's going to feel almost effortless and almost like we're under no threat the entire time. Whilst if we're in a hard matchup, it's going to be an absolute nightmare. So is Corki good in draft? Yes, but I definitely recommend them as a counter pick. And as we can see, there's a lot of counter pickable options here. So now let's talk about if Corki is actually hidden OP. I believe that Corki in the right scenario is very, very good and can almost be considered OP. So what's the right scenario? If we are able to slow down the game pace, that's one. And the second scenario is if we have a good draft or a good opponent in lane. If we can survive that lane, I'm pretty sure that we can carry through the mid and the late game. And that's basically what we're going to be aiming for as Corki. And our kit and our runes allow us to do that too. So I think if we can get ourselves a good draft and we can minimize the early game, make sure that our team doesn't fight too much, so we don't have too many scrappy junglers or a heavy trading top side or a heavy trading bot side that can be influenced by our enemy laner, we're in a very good spot to carry the game mid to late game. And if we reach to that position, yes, the Corki is definitely OP. To add on to that, I think that in competitive play, Corki is especially going to be very, very strong. And in solo queue too, but a bit less. Because in solo queue, there's a bit more chaos and a bit less scenarios where we can safely pick the Corki. So I think if you play competitive, Corki is definitely one that's got to be on your list to pick up right now. But in solo queue as well, but we got to be a bit more careful, especially with blind picking them and understanding how the game pace is going to pan out, fast or slow. So finally, if you want to play Corki, there's some must-apply tips that I have for you. First one is play safe early. Because of our weak early game and weak skirmishing, we want to avoid those skirmishes until we have Muramana. Once we reach Muramana, we get a lot of AD, and then we can actually play those skirmishes. Also, we skill very well with levels, so that's the time where we can start doing stuff. We also want to play to stack dragons, especially combine our package usage with the dragons. Use our package and TP combined to surprise the enemies. And our package is such a strong tool. It's almost unbeatable if we use it correctly. It does massive amount of damage. It's an insane engage, massive mobility. So use our package nicely and combine them with objectives. Also, in lane, use our W for self peel. Because our early lane is so weak, we don't really want to use W forward, but mainly use it to W out when people want to engage onto us. This way we can minimize more effectively. We also want to be first at objectives and poke with our R. Our poke is insane, especially if people need to walk into us. It's very hard to walk into a Corki with his rockets up, because he's going to deal massive amounts of damage and he will outpoke you before you're even able to contest the objective. Then finally, play around first strike, especially in a lot of matchups on mid lane. What I like to do is I like to activate my E when I have first strike, go for a little E auto attack trade onto the enemies, get that 10 gold with our first strike, and then back off again. We get money from it, we get a decent trade from it while we're not being overly aggressive in the trades. This is especially good against melee champion users. We can easily stack our first strike onto those champions and get extremely rich from that. And as we know, we skill with items, we skill with the game time, so we just get extremely strong, extremely fast when we get a lot of gold. So I thank you all for watching this video, and I hope you have a great weekend. We got some more stuff coming up next week, so like the video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I see you guys next week. Bye bye.